My husband asked me to come to the rail to see dolphins. Then I got a text. Your husband is trying to harm you. But my phone fell into the water, and I realized I was alone in the ocean with a man who had been planning to get rid of me for 12 years. Before I walk you through the full story, I just have a small favor to ask. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments. What city are you watching from? It's always amazing to see how far this audience is reaching. When Mark suggested the spontaneous trip to Santa Catalina Island, I should have known something was wrong. In 12 years of marriage, my husband had never been the spontaneous type. He was methodical, careful, a man who planned his grocery list 3 days in advance and color-coded his academic calendar. Romance had died in our marriage years ago, buried under his increasing coldness and my growing sense that I was living with a stranger. But that Tuesday morning, he had walked into the kitchen with coffee and a printed itinerary, his eyes brighter than I had seen them in months. A weekend getaway, he said, just the two of us on a secluded island off the California coast. No cell towers, no internet, no distractions, just us and the ocean. I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered why he had chosen such an isolated location, why he had insisted on leaving immediately, why he had been so specific about the timing. Instead, I found myself caught up in the possibility that maybe somehow we could salvage what was left of our relationship. The boat ride to Santa Catalina had been pleasant enough. Mark had been attentive in a way he hadn't been for years, pointing out landmarks and asking about my work. For brief moments, I almost forgot about the growing distance between us, the way he had been coming home later and later, the strange phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. We checked into a small resort overlooking the harbor, and Mark immediately began planning our activities with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. A sunrise boat trip, he decided, would be the perfect way to start our romantic weekend. He had already arranged everything with a local guide, he told me. All I had to do was wake up early and trust him. That night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the waves crash against the shore, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Maybe this trip was exactly what we needed. Maybe Mark had finally realized what he was about to lose. I fell asleep with a smile on my face, completely unaware that I was already trapped. The alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning, and Mark was already dressed and ready. He had coffee waiting for me, along with a light breakfast and a jacket he insisted I would need on the water. His efficiency should have alarmed me, but I was still caught up in the romantic gesture of it all. The marina was deserted except for a few fishing boats preparing for the early morning run. Our guide was waiting beside a sleek motor yacht, a weathered man with dark skin and muscles that spoke of years working on the water. Mark introduced him simply as Lucas, and the two men exchanged a look that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't say why. As we pulled away from the harbor, I watched the lights of the resort fade into the distance. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the world was painted in shades of gray and deep blue. Mark stood beside me at the rail, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. But as we moved farther from shore, something began to shift. Mark's attentiveness faded, replaced by a cold distance that felt more familiar than his earlier warmth. He stopped pointing out the scenery, stopped asking about my comfort. Instead, he stood at the bow, staring out at the horizon with an expression I couldn't read. Lucas, our guide, had been friendly enough at the marina, but once we were underway, he became silent and focused. He handled the boat with easy competence, but there was something in the way he looked at me that made my skin crawl. It wasn't attraction or interest, but something colder, something that made me feel like prey. The realization hit me slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. This wasn't a romantic gesture. The isolation, the early hour, the careful planning, it all felt less like romance and more like something else, something I didn't want to name. I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the beauty of the sunrise, beginning to paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. But the feeling of wrongness continued to grow, settling in my stomach like a cold stone. When my phone buzzed with an incoming message, I almost ignored it. Who would be texting me at this hour? But something made me look, and what I saw made my blood freeze. The message was from Ethan Rivera, a writer I had met just yesterday at the resort. We had spoken briefly over coffee, and I had mentioned our planned boat trip. His message was short and terrifying. "Don't go out in the boat. Your husband is trying to harm you." The phone slipped from my hands, as if my fingers had forgotten how to grip. I watched in horror as it tumbled through the air, bounced once off the rail, and disappeared into the dark water with barely a splash. The sound of my lifeline vanishing was swallowed by the engine noise and the whisper of waves against the hull. Mark turned at the sound, and when he saw my empty hands and pale face, something flickered in his eyes. Not concern, as I might have expected, but something that looked almost like satisfaction. He asked what was wrong, but his voice carried no real worry. It was the tone someone might use when asking about the weather, polite but ultimately uninterested in the answer. I told him I had dropped my phone, and he made a sympathetic noise that didn't reach his eyes. The sun was rising now, painting the water in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Under any other circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like watching the world light up for the last time. I forced myself to think clearly, to push past the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. If Ethan's warning was true, and every instinct I had told me it was, then I was trapped on a boat with two men who meant me harm. I couldn't swim well enough to reach shore, couldn't call for help, couldn't even be sure that anyone would miss me until it was too late. But I wasn't helpless. I had one advantage that Mark might not have counted on. I was no longer the naive woman who had married him 12 years ago. Those years had taught me things about survival, about reading people, about the length someone would go to when they thought they were unobserved. So I did what I had learned to do best during our marriage. I pretended. I smiled and told Mark how beautiful the sunrise was. I asked Lucas about the local marine life, trying to gauge his level of involvement in whatever was planned. I acted like a woman enjoying a romantic morning with her husband, while my mind raced through possibilities and escape plans. Mark seemed to relax when I didn't mention the phone again. He moved closer, putting his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that once would have comforted me. Now it felt like a cage closing around me. He suggested we move to the front of the boat for a better view of the sunrise. His hand on my back was gentle but insistent, guiding me toward the bow, where the rail was lower and the water deeper. Every step felt like walking toward my own grave. That was when I knew I had to act. Time was running out, and soon Mark would make his move. I had to find a way to delay him, to create enough time for someone to miss us, for help to arrive, for anything that might save my life. So I stopped walking and turned to face my husband, the man I had loved for 12 years, the man who apparently had been planning my destruction for who knows how long, and I told him we needed to talk. As I looked into Mark's eyes on that boat surrounded by nothing but ocean and sky, I finally began to understand how completely I had been manipulated. The realization didn't come all at once, but in waves, each memory reshaping itself as I saw it through the lens of truth instead of love. It had started so gradually that I hadn't noticed. Mark had never been obviously controlling or abusive. Instead, he had been subtle, patient, slowly reshaping my world until he was at the center of everything and I had nowhere else to turn. The isolation had begun almost immediately after our wedding. Mark had been concerned about my family's influence on our marriage, he said. My parents were too involved, too critical of him. They didn't understand our relationship, and their constant interference was causing stress that we didn't need as newlyweds. He had been so reasonable about it, so articulate in his concerns, that I had agreed to limit contact with my family. Just temporarily, he assured me, until we had established ourselves as a couple. What harm could it do to focus on each other for a while? My friends had been next. Mark had been more subtle there, never directly forbidding me from seeing them, but somehow always having conflicts when I made plans. Work emergencies, family obligations, health issues that required my immediate attention and support. One by one, my friendships had withered from neglect, and I had told myself it was just part of growing up, of becoming a married woman with new priorities. The job had taken longer. Mark had been clever enough to wait until I was comfortable with my dependence on him before suggesting that maybe I didn't need the stress of full-time work. We were financially stable with his university salary, he pointed out. And wouldn't it be nice if I had more time to focus on our home, our relationship, our future family? I had resisted at first, but Mark had been patient. He had pointed out how exhausted I always was, how the long hours were affecting my health, how much happier I seemed on weekends when I wasn't thinking about work. Gradually, his concern had worn down my resistance, and I had agreed to take a leave of absence that somehow became permanent. By the end of our second year of marriage, my world had shrunk to the size of our house and Mark's presence within it. I told myself I was happy, that this was what marriage was supposed to be like. Two people so perfectly matched that they didn't need anyone else. I didn't recognize it as a prison until it was too late to escape. The financial control had been even more insidious than the social isolation. Mark had positioned it as protection, as his way of taking care of me, so I wouldn't have to worry about the mundane details of money management. It had started with small things. Mark took over the bill, paying because he was better with numbers, because he enjoyed the organizational aspect of it, because it was one less thing for me to stress about. I had been grateful at first, happy to hand over the tedious work of balancing checkbooks and tracking expenses. Then he had suggested combining our accounts. It made sense, he argued, for married couples to share their finances completely. Separate accounts created unnecessary complications and suggested a lack of trust. Besides, with me working reduced hours, it would be simpler to manage everything from one central location. I had agreed because it seemed reasonable, because I trusted him, because I couldn't imagine a scenario where Mark would use money to control me. He had never been materialistic or greedy. If anything, he had always been almost austere in his personal spending, preferring books and academic conferences to luxury goods. But once the accounts were combined, Mark had gradually taken over every aspect of our financial life. He paid the bills, managed the investments, made decisions about major purchases. When I needed money for personal expenses, I had to ask him, had to explain what I wanted to buy and why it was necessary. He was never cruel about it, never made me feel stupid or irresponsible. Instead, he positioned himself as the wise guardian of our financial security, protecting us both from the dangers of overspending or poor investment choices. He made me feel like my lack of interest in financial details was a charming personality quirk rather than a forced dependence. The credit cards had been next. Mark had been concerned about security, about the risk of identity theft and fraud. It would be safer, he suggested, if I used supplementary cards tied to his accounts rather than maintaining my own credit lines. That way, he could monitor for suspicious activity and respond quickly if there were any problems. I had agreed because his reasoning made sense, because I trusted him to look out for our best interests, because I had no idea that he was systematically removing my ability to function independently in the world. By the time I realized what had happened, I had no credit in my own name, no bank accounts, no financial identity separate from Mark's. I couldn't rent an apartment, couldn't get a loan, couldn't even open a checking account without his involvement and approval. I was trapped as effectively as if he had locked me in a physical cage, and I had walked into it willingly, one reasonable request at a time. The emotional abuse had been the hardest to recognize because Mark had been so skilled at it. He had never raised his voice, never called me names, never done anything that would leave visible bruises or obvious scars. Instead, he had used words like surgical instruments, cutting away at my confidence and self-worth with precision and patience. It had started with small corrections, gentle suggestions that maybe I was remembering something wrong or interpreting a situation incorrectly. When I disagreed with his version of events, Mark would become concerned about my stress levels, my emotional stability, and my tendency to overreact to minor issues. He had been so caring in his corrections, so worried about my well-being, that I had begun to doubt my own perceptions. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I was letting my emotions cloud my judgment. Maybe Mark really did know better than I did about what was best for us both. The pattern had become predictable over time. First, there would be a period of calm when Mark was attentive and loving, when he seemed like the man I had fallen in love with. These honeymoon phases could last for weeks or even months, and I would convince myself that whatever problems we had been having were resolved. Then the tension would begin to build. Mark would become more critical, more distant, more likely to find fault with everything I did. He would question my decisions, my intelligence, my ability to handle even simple tasks. The criticism was always delivered with concern, always framed as his attempt to help me become a better person. The explosion, when it came, was never physical. Instead, Mark would deliver devastating critiques of my character, my worth, my contribution to our marriage. He would list my failures with the same methodical precision he brought to his academic work, building an airtight case for why I was lucky he stayed with me at all. Then would come the reconciliation phase, when Mark would apologize for being so harsh, would explain that he only criticized me because he loved me and wanted me to reach my full potential. He would be gentle and attentive again, and I would be so grateful for the return of his affection that I would promise to do better, to be the wife he deserved. The cycle had repeated itself dozens of times over the years, each iteration wearing away a little more of my sense of self until I could no longer trust my own thoughts and feelings. I had become completely dependent on Mark's approval for any sense of self-worth, completely convinced that my value as a person was determined by his assessment of my performance as his wife. By the time I recognized the pattern, I was so far under his psychological control that I couldn't imagine existing without him, couldn't conceive of a life where I made my own decisions and trusted my own judgment. I had become exactly what he needed me to be, a woman so broken and dependent that she would never leave him, never question him, never threaten his carefully constructed life. The medical manipulation had been perhaps the most sinister aspect of Mark's control, because it had involved my body, my health, my fundamental sense of reality, and I might never have discovered it if not for my father's connections in the medical field. It had started with vitamins. Mark had become concerned about my health, he said, about my energy levels and frequent headaches. He had researched nutritional supplements and found a combination that he thought would help. The pills came in unmarked bottles, pre-portioned into daily doses, and Mark had been so thoughtful about reminding me to take them every morning. I had been grateful for his attention to my health, especially since I had been feeling increasingly tired and emotionally unstable. The vitamins seemed to help at first, but then I had begun experiencing strange side effects: dizziness, confusion, difficulty concentrating, mood swings that seemed to come from nowhere. When I mentioned these symptoms to Mark, he had been immediately concerned. Perhaps I should see a doctor, he suggested. As it happened, he knew someone who specialized in women's health issues, someone who would be discreet about what might be a sensitive situation. The doctor Mark recommended had been professional and thorough, but something about the appointment had felt wrong. The questions had been lead-in, designed to elicit answers that supported a particular diagnosis. When I described my symptoms, the doctor had nodded knowingly and made notes about stress, anxiety, possible depression. The prescription that followed had been for anti-anxiety medication and antidepressants. The doctor had explained that many women my age experienced hormonal changes that could affect their mental health, that there was no shame in needing pharmaceutical support during a difficult transition. I had trusted the doctor because Mark had recommended him, had trusted Mark because he was my husband and claimed to love me. I had taken the medications faithfully, not realizing that they were designed to make me more compliant, more confused, more dependent on others to interpret reality for me. The real breakthrough had come during a routine visit to my father's clinic. Dad had been concerned about my appearance, about the weight loss, and the glassy look in my eyes. When he asked about medications, I had shown him the bottles Mark had given me. Dad's expression had changed immediately. The supplements weren't vitamins at all, but a cocktail of prescription drugs, including mild sedatives and mood stabilizers. The dosages were carefully calculated to create dependence and confusion without causing obvious harm. More disturbing still were the medical records Dad found when he investigated further. Mark had been building a case for my mental instability, sharing carefully edited information with multiple doctors to create a paper trail of psychological problems and erratic behavior. If something had happened to me, if I had disappeared or had an accident, Mark would have had medical documentation to support whatever story he chose to tell. He could have claimed that I was suicidal, that I had a history of dangerous behavior, that my demise was tragic but not entirely unexpected. The realization that Mark had been systematically poisoning me, both physically and psychologically, had been the final piece of evidence I needed to understand the true scope of his plan. The affair had been going on for 2 years, though I suspected Mark's emotional detachment had begun long before he found someone new to focus on. Leah Monroe was everything I wasn't: young, vibrant, unmarried, uncomplicated by years of psychological manipulation and learned helplessness. I had discovered the relationship by accident through a phone call that came to our home phone instead of Mark's cell. The woman on the other end had been confused when I answered, had stammered something about a wrong number before hanging up quickly, but she had asked for Mark using a nickname that only someone very close to him would know. The investigation that followed had been heartbreaking in its thoroughness. Mark had been living an entire second life with Leah, had been introducing himself as a divorced professor who was finally free to pursue a healthy relationship after years in a difficult marriage. She was a graduate student in the English department, young enough to be impressed by Mark's academic credentials and mature enough to believe his stories about his cold, unstable wife who refused to grant him a divorce. To Leah, Mark was a romantic figure, a brilliant man trapped in a loveless marriage by a woman too selfish to let him go. The pictures I found on Mark's hidden social media accounts showed a version of him I barely recognized. With Leah, he was warm, affectionate, spontaneous. He took her to concerts and art galleries, cooked elaborate dinners, surprised her with thoughtful gifts. He was the man I had fallen in love with 12 years ago, before he had decided I was an obstacle to his happiness rather than a partner in it. The timeline was damning. Mark had begun withdrawing from our marriage at exactly the same time he had started pursuing Leah. Every cold dinner, every rejected attempt at intimacy, every cruel comment about my appearance or intelligence had coincided with his growing involvement with a woman who represented everything he claimed to want in a partner. But the most chilling discovery was in Mark's search history on his personal computer. He had been researching accidental drowning, life insurance policies, the legal process for declaring someone deceased when a body was never recovered. He had bookmarked articles about surviving spouses and inheritance laws, about how long someone had to wait before remarrying after their partner's presumed demise. Mark hadn't just been planning to leave me for Leah, he had been planning to eliminate me entirely, to collect my life insurance and my father's inheritance, and to start fresh with a woman who would never know what had happened to his first wife. The boat trip to Santa Catalina hadn't been a romantic gesture or a last-ditch attempt to save our marriage. It had been the execution of a plan Mark had been developing for months, a plan that would finally give him the life he wanted with the woman he loved. As I stood on that boat watching Mark position himself between me and any hope of safety, I finally understood that this wasn't his first attempt to get rid of me. The pattern had been there all along, but I had been too trusting, too willing to believe in accidents and coincidences to see it for what it was. The fall down the stairs 8 months ago hadn't been an accident. I had been carrying laundry to the basement when the lights had suddenly gone out, plunging the stairwell into complete darkness. I had missed the last 3 steps and tumbled hard onto the concrete floor, spraining my wrist and bruising my ribs badly enough to require medical attention. Mark had been so concerned, so guilty about the burned-out bulb he claimed to have forgotten to replace. He had taken such good care of me during my recovery, had been attentive and loving in a way he hadn't been for years. At the time, I had been grateful for the reminder that he still cared about me, still worried about my welfare. Now I realized that the bulb hadn't burned out. Mark had unscrewed it, had waited for me to attempt the stairs in the dark, had counted on my tumbling down hard enough to break my neck or crack my skull. The only reason I had survived was that the laundry basket had cushioned my fall, and I had instinctively tried to protect myself rather than falling freely. The food poisoning had been another attempt. Mark had prepared dinner one evening, something he rarely did, claiming he wanted to surprise me with my favorite meal. Within hours, I had been violently ill, vomiting and cramping so severely that Mark had rushed me to the emergency room. The doctors had been puzzled by the severity of my symptoms, had run tests for various toxins and bacterial infections without finding a clear cause. They had eventually attributed it to a particularly virulent strain of food poisoning and had sent me home with instructions to rest and stay hydrated. Mark had been the perfect caregiver during my recovery, bringing me soup and medication, monitoring my temperature, staying home from work to watch over me. I had been touched by his devotion, grateful that my illness had brought out his protective instincts. But now I remembered details that had seemed unimportant at the time. Mark had eaten the same meal without getting sick, had claimed his stomach was stronger than mine. He had been unusually insistent about preparing my portions himself, had been careful to serve me from specific areas of the dishes he had cooked. The car accident had been the most recent attempt and the most obviously suspicious in hindsight. I had been driving to a doctor's appointment when the brakes had failed completely, sending me careening through a busy intersection and into a light pole. I had been lucky to escape with only a concussion and some bruised ribs. Lucky that the other drivers had been paying attention and had managed to avoid me. The mechanic had been puzzled by the brake failure, had muttered about brake lines that looked like they had been tampered with rather than wearing out naturally. But Mark had been quick to attribute it to poor maintenance, had apologized for not staying on top of the car's service schedule, had promised to be more careful about such things in the future. Each incident had seemed like a random misfortune at the time, the kind of accidents that could happen to anyone. But viewed together, they formed a clear pattern of escalating attempts on my life, each one designed to look like an accident, each one bringing Mark closer to his goal of becoming a widower. I had survived them all through luck rather than vigilance, through coincidence rather than caution, but Mark had learned from each failure, had refined his methods, had waited for the perfect opportunity to finish what he had started. The boat trip was that perfect opportunity, isolated, no witnesses, no way for investigators to determine exactly what had happened in the middle of the ocean. Standing on the deck of that boat with the California coastline just a distant smudge on the horizon, I made a decision that would either save my life or seal my fate. I couldn't outrun Mark, couldn't overpower him, couldn't swim to safety, but I could use the one weapon I had left, the truth. So I told him I knew what he was planning. I told him about Ethan's warning, about my father's analysis of the medications he had been giving me, about the evidence I had discovered of his affair with Laya. I told him I knew about the previous attempts on my life, about the research he had done into accidental drowning, about the life insurance policies he had taken out without my knowledge. Mark's reaction was everything I had expected and feared. The mask of concern and affection that he had worn for 12 years finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. He didn't deny anything, didn't try to explain or justify his actions. Instead, he seemed almost relieved that the pretense was finally over. He told me that I had been a disappointment from the beginning, that he had married me for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with convenience and social expectations. My father's medical connections had been useful for his research. My inheritance would be useful for his future, but I myself had never been anything more than a means to an end. Laya represented everything he had always wanted in a partner: youth, beauty, intelligence, unmarred by years of psychological manipulation. She saw him as the man he truly was, brilliant and sophisticated and worthy of devotion. She would never question his decisions or challenge his authority the way I had learned to do in recent months. The plan was simple and elegant. I would fall overboard during our romantic sunrise cruise, probably while leaning over the rail to photograph the dolphins that Mark had promised to show me. Lucas, our guide, would testify that it had been a terrible accident, that Mark had tried desperately to save me, but the current had been too strong. Mark would be the grieving widower, devastated by the loss of his beloved wife, but eventually finding comfort in the arms of a young graduate student who understood his pain. He would collect my life insurance, inherit my share of my father's medical practice, and start fresh with a woman who had no knowledge of his true nature. It was a perfect plan. Except for one thing, Ethan Rivera had been watching from the shore when Mark had met with Lucas the night before. Ethan had seen money change hands, had heard enough of their conversation to understand what was being arranged. And Ethan had already contacted the Coast Guard. I didn't tell Mark about that last part. Instead, I let him believe that his plan was proceeding smoothly, that I was helpless and trapped and resigned to my fate. I needed him to feel confident, to lower his guard, to give me the opportunity I was waiting for. When Mark finally moved to push me overboard, I was ready for him. The moment Mark reached for me, I threw myself backward onto the deck, making it look like I had tripped in my panic to get away from him. I hit the fiberglass hard enough to bruise my shoulder and scrape my palms, but the pain was nothing compared to the relief of having a solid deck beneath me instead of an empty ocean. Mark lunged forward, apparently thinking I was trying to crawl away from him, and I rolled to the side just as his hands closed on empty air where my ankles had been. His momentum carried him forward, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to tumble overboard himself. But Mark recovered his balance and turned toward me with an expression of such pure rage that I barely recognized him. This wasn't the cold, calculating professor I had lived with for 12 years. This was something primal and dangerous, a predator whose carefully laid plans had suddenly gone wrong. Lucas, our guide, was shouting something in Spanish and moving toward us, apparently alarmed by the commotion on his deck. But before he could intervene, I heard the sound that Mark had been dreading, the low rumble of powerful engines approaching from the direction of shore. The Coast Guard cutter appeared around the point of the island like an answer to prayers I hadn't dared to voice. It was moving fast, throwing up a white wake as it closed the distance between us. Behind it came a smaller patrol boat, and I could see figures on both vessels preparing to board our yacht. Mark's face went white as he realized what was happening. He spun toward Lucas and began speaking rapidly in what sounded like Spanish, apparently trying to convince the guide to stick to their original story. But Lucas was already backing away from both of us, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. The recording device I had activated when Mark first revealed his plans was still running, hidden in the inner pocket of the jacket he had so thoughtfully provided for me that morning. Every word of his confession, every detail of his plan, every admission of the previous attempts on my life had been captured on a device that was waterproof and equipped with GPS tracking. When the Coast Guard officers boarded our yacht, they found exactly what Ethan had told them to expect: a woman in immediate danger, a man caught in the act of attempted elimination, and a guide who was eager to confess his role in exchange for leniency. Mark tried to maintain his innocence even as they placed him in restraints. He claimed that I was having some kind of psychological breakdown, that I had been making wild accusations and threatening to harm myself. He played the part of the concerned husband perfectly, right up until they played back the recording of his confession. The sound of his own voice, admitting to years of calculated abuse and multiple attempts on my life, finally broke through his facade. For the first time since I had known him, Mark had nothing to say, no explanation to offer, no way to manipulate the situation to his advantage. As they led him away, he looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It might have been respect or surprise, or simply the recognition that he had finally met someone who could outmaneuver him at his own game. The Coast Guard cutter transported us back to the mainland, where Mark and Lucas were immediately taken into custody, and I was rushed to the hospital for evaluation. The doctors found traces of the medications Mark had been giving me still in my system, along with evidence of the various injuries I had sustained during his previous attempts on my life. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Mark's computer revealed the extent of his planning, from the research into accidental drowning to the detailed timeline he had developed for implementing his plan. His communication with Lucas showed that this wasn't an impulsive crime, but a carefully orchestrated attempt that had been months in the making. Lia Monroe was questioned as a potential accomplice, but it quickly became clear that she had been as much a victim of Mark's manipulation as I had been. She had genuinely believed that Mark was divorced, had no knowledge of his plans for me, and was horrified to learn the truth about the man she thought she loved. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The tampered brake lines on my car, the prescription drugs found in Mark's possession, the insurance policies he had taken out without my knowledge, the financial records showing payments to Lucas for services that had nothing to do with legitimate boat charters. But perhaps most damning was the recording of Mark's confession, played back in a courtroom where his cold description of his plans sounded even more chilling than it had on the boat. The jury took less than 3 hours to find him guilty on charges of attempted homicide, conspiracy, fraud, and domestic abuse. Lucas received a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation, but he would still spend several years in prison for his role in the conspiracy. Mark was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to manipulate and harm another woman. The civil case that followed resulted in the recovery of all the assets Mark had stolen or misdirected during our marriage, plus damages for the years of abuse and the attempts on my life. More importantly, it established a legal record of his crimes that would prevent him from ever again presenting himself as the victim of a difficult marriage. As I walked out of the courthouse after Mark's sentencing, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 12 years: complete freedom. For the first time since our wedding day, I was able to make decisions based on my own needs and desires rather than fear of his reaction. The woman who had boarded that yacht had been broken, isolated, and convinced of her own inadequacy. The woman who walked away from the courthouse was strong, supported, and certain of her worth. Mark had tried to destroy me, but instead he had inadvertently forced me to discover just how much I was capable of surviving. The dolphins we had supposedly gone to see that morning had never appeared. But in trying to eliminate me, Mark had given me something far more valuable: the knowledge that I was stronger than either of us had ever imagined, and the freedom to finally live the life I deserved.